So here I am back at the sewing machine and I'm ready to do the top stitching on my binding to do the finishing stitching to sew it to the quilt top. I suggest that you use one of 2 feet. Some people like to use this, Fluff calls it a narrow edge foot, but all the machine manufacturers make a similar foot, but it's a foot that has a little guide in the center, kind of like a stitch in the ditch foot, but it has a wide opening back here so that you can move your needle. So I would suggest using either that foot or your general purpose foot, as long as it's got clearance so that you can see what's going on with the needle. And I use them interchangeably. I don't know that I have a preference one over the other. It just depends on the mood that I'm in that day. So the thread that you want to use in the needle could be a thread that matches in color your binding, or you might use a decorative thread, or you might use an invisible thread. And we'll come back and talk about invisible thread a little more later. In the bobbin, I would use a thread that matches the binding, regardless of what thread you're using in the needle. But that's just an option. You do what works best for you, what you like best. Okay, I'm going to show you first setting this up to use it with the general purpose foot that came with the machine. And on the fluff foot here, there is a little red tick mark over here. And that's about 1/8 of an inch from the needle. So I'm going to set it up with that little red tick mark right on top of the edge of the binding. And I want you to notice when I pull back my binding fold, you see where the black line is there? That's my stitching line from when I sewed the binding onto the back. I'm going to put that little edge right over that seam, that stitching seam, and I'm going to hold it in place with my stiletto. Now if you look back here at the needle, you're going to see that it appears to be pretty far in. It's 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the binding, and I think that's a little bit far. So I'm going to move my needle position a couple of clicks, maybe 3 clicks to the left, maybe 4. You'll have to decide what you think looks best to you. So I have it in the -1.0 position right now. I wanted to stitch along the edge of the binding here, but I also wanted to catch the binding on the back. So I have the fold right over the stitching line, and I'm going to hold it in place with my stiletto. And you want your needle down engaged so that when it stops with the needle down in the fabric. And you're going to stop frequently and readjust where that fold line is. You want to sew slowly. And as you're approaching a pin down here, you want to take the pin out so that again you can place that fold right over the stitching line. Don't sew over your pins, because your pins, if you leave the pins in, you're not assured that the fold line is placed exactly where it needs to be. And as I get down here to this corner, first of all, I have a pin in the way here that I probably need to take out in the other direction. going to take this one out. Make sure that my fold is just over the seam line. And I'm going to stitch past the corner about as far as the stitching is in from the edge. And then we're going to pivot. And I think I need to go one more stitch because this is not quite where it needs to be. It needs to be like one stitch over onto the edge more. So I'm going to take one more stitch. You can do that by hand if you wish. And pivot. Raise the foot to pivot position. And pivot. And keep that fold right over the stitching line. So let's see how we're doing over here. If I turn my camera over here to where I have stitched, and I turn this over, you can see that my stitching on the back is right along the edge of the binding on the back side. Okay, I am going to change the foot just to show you how you would use that other foot. Ordinarily, I would tie off before I do this. Secure my thread ends. I want to bring my bobbin thread tail to the top because I don't want it to be left on the back where it can create a thread nest. Take my threads underneath the foot. I'm going to put my needle back in that 0 position. And now I'm going to, oops, bump the camera there. I'm going to put my quilt underneath the foot. I'm going to put the foot down so that the guide right here, this guide, is right along the edge of the binding. And then I'm going to move the needle to the right this time. Well, doesn't seem to be wanting to cooperate here. So I want to move it over to about that same distance that I had it before. So right now, in order to get it over that far, I've moved it to 2.5, actually 2.8 millimeters to the right. And actually when you do this top stitching, you might want to lengthen your stitch length. I had left it on 2, but I'm taking it up to 3 because I think that would be a little nicer look. Stopping with the needle down in the fabric. And still keeping the edge of the binding right over that stitching line. Use the stiletto to control the fabric going into the needle. So I'm going to cut off the camera for just a minute until I get, so I can sew down to this corner, and then I'll show you how I'll turn the corner with this foot. Okay, so I'm down here approaching the corner. I'm going to take this other pin out of the corner here too, because that's just going to create bulk that I don't need. So I'm going to sew straight, keep sewing straight ahead until I have sewn the distance I need onto this other side of the binding. It's not as easy to see as it is with the general purpose foot, but it looks like I've done that pretty well. I poked my finger with a pin, and so that's a little blood right there. And you know the best thing to get blood out of fabric is saliva. So if you just wash it with a little bit of saliva on a paper towel or a tissue, it should take it right out of there. Okay, I'm not going to finish this because we're going to take a look at it. I'm going to, sorry, I'm going to cut my thread here and take it off so we can take a look at it and see what we think of it. So here's the corner that I'm sewing with that narrow edge foot. And you can, of course, move your needle over so that you're stitching closer to this edge if you wish. On the back, I'm catching it all on the binding, which is good. It's pretty good coming down there. And around this corner down here where I started. Pretty good. I'm going to show you a couple of other things you could do with thread or with stitches, other stitches you could use. So bear with me just a minute while I change some things around here. I had taken my sewing table off so that I could get the camera in closer. It makes it a little harder to sew. What I've done now is put the sewing table back on the extension table. This time I have switched my top thread so it's a thread that matches my binding a little bit better. And I have put in a zigzag stitch this time, and it's just your ordinary zigzag stitch, but I set it very narrow. So I have it set at 2.8 millimeters in width. And the length I just left at its default setting of 3 in this case. And I'm just going to sew over the edge of the binding. I'm going to keep the binding, I'm going to try to keep my the binding is a little bit to the left of center. But once again, I'm still trying to keep the edge of the binding right over the stitching line. And the left side of this zigzag stitch will be stitching either right on the edge or just off the edge of the binding. So that's one possibility for a different stitch, and we'll come back and look at that more clearly later. But it makes a very nice makes a pretty nice edge there, I think. Another stitch that you might try using is a pin stitch. And you'll find that in your quilting stitches category. Some people call it a blanket stitch. And it's set, it's this stitch number 7. But you notice that the step overs are going to the left and we want them to go to the right, so we'll have to mirror image that. And I'm going to leave it at its default settings of 2.5 millimeters wide and 3 millimeters long. So to mirror image, you have to find the mirror image on your machine. On mine, it's right here, so I'm just going to mirror image that. And then this is what it's going to look like on screen. Actually, I'm going to take back what I just said. I'm going to use stitch number 6. I still have to mirror image it, but I think it's a little better stitch for what I'm doing here, and I'll explain why later. But again, my setting is going to be 2.5 millimeters wide, 2.5 millimeters long, and I need to mirror image it so that it flips the other way. And on screen it looks like this. So when I get down here to the corner with this stitch, I'm going to want to step off and stop with it just off of the edge of the binding. And I want to pivot and make sure that I'm positioned right where I want to be to start stitching again. And it looks to me like I'm just a little bit to the left. So I'm just going to raise my needle and shift and raise my foot to pivot position and just move my fabric over there and put the needle down and put the foot back down. And the other thing that I like to do when I'm doing these a decorative stitch like this, or an applique stitch like this, when I pivot around a corner, I'm going to push my reset button. And on the FOF machines, that reset button is this one. And that takes the stitch back to the beginning of the stitch pattern. Now, if it has a little trouble getting started up because you're on a bulky edge there, remember to use your hump jumper to help it along a little bit. Okay, I'm going to show you one more stitch that people like to use. Some people like to use a serpentine stitch. Serpentine stitch is a stitch like number 1 here or number 2, and you could set it for width and length, whatever pleases you. There's also number 3 on this machine. Any of those would work. Now the serpentine stitch, when you use it, it's going to go back and forth. It's going to start in the center of the stitching field, and it's going to go swing widely on both sides of that stitching field. So you can choose to have it stitched way over here into the quilt top, or you can move your fabric so that the swing is going to stay on the binding. So my stitch is 9 millimeters wide, so it's going to kind of swing across this whole binding field. Stop with your needle down always. Use your stiletto to hold the fold in place. All right, that's as much as I'm going to do. We're going to take a look at the back side of the fabric and see how our stitching is doing on the back. So here's the back side of the serpentine stitch. It still has black thread in it, which of course you'd want thread that matches your binding. Here's the back side of that pin stitch or blanket stitch that we were doing. And I've lost my zigzag stitch. This was the pin stitch, and this is the back side of that little zigzag stitch. So again, on the front side, this is the zigzag stitch, this is the little pin stitch, and this is the serpentine stitch. You can play with some other decorative stitches on your machine. Go practice and have fun. One other thing that I'll comment on, you remember we cut our binding 2.5 inches wide. If you do a sample and you decide that you have too much blank space in here where there's no batting, that just means that you should cut your binding strips a little bit narrower. So try cutting them 2 3/8 of an inch or 2 1/4 of an inch. You have to kind of play with things a little bit, do a couple of samples to make sure that your final product is going to be what you want it to be. So go and have fun. One more thing. I meant to tell you that for all of these stitches, you could use invisible thread instead of a thread that matches your fabric. I don't know that the serpentine stitch there's any advantage for the invisible thread, but like if you wanted to use invisible thread down here on this little zigzag stitch, the stitch would actually kind of almost disappear into your fabric, and you would it would hardly be visible at all. And in that case, you would want to use invisible thread probably in both the needle and the bobbin, but you could use it just in the needle and use a complementary color thread or a matching thread in the bobbin. Okay, go and enjoy.